The characteristic of any culture measurement and management system has to be that it's culture sensitive for a couple of different reasons. The culture that produces success in a school is not the same culture that will produce success in a military situation, or the same culture that will produce success in a factory of some kind. And the culture that will produce success in one country is often not like that which will produce success in another. There's a book called Culture Craft, which talks about national cultures. And one of the examples in there, do you have PT Cruisers here? Do you have the Chrysler product, the PT Cruiser? Before I tell this story, would anybody raise their hand who owns a PT Cruiser? Okay, I can tell a story then. And actually, it's not, well, I might interject some personal stuff. Because my wife tells me that when I give talks, every once in a while I say something and I offend somebody, it ruins the whole thing. So I don't want to do that. And Kelvin knows my wife really well, and he's probably going to report back on me. So I wouldn't want that to happen. But in the Culture Craft, it talks about the PT Cruiser and how Daimler-Benz bought Chrysler just as the PT Cruiser was kind of going to be introduced. And the German culture code for cars is engineering. And the American culture code for cars is recognition. Like, oh, he's got a really cute car, or whatever. So the Germans decided that the PT Cruiser was a piece of junk. It had a bad turning radius, its acceleration wasn't good, its gas mileage was bad, the seats were uncomfortable, and a few other problems. And my wife and I actually looked at those cars, and they're basically right, by my reckoning. I did not buy one. But anyway, this was the assessment of the Germans. So they said, well, we're going to make these cars because they're out there, and somebody's probably going to buy them, but we're going to only open one little factory and make a few of them. Well, the Americans went crazy over the cars because everybody wanted to have one in their driveway, so their neighbors would say, oh, you've got a cute little car, okay? So the Germans had to ramp up, and they couldn't make enough of them fast enough, and they lost a bundle of money because of it. And what was the reason why they basically had a business failure? The culture. They didn't adequately understand the culture. So no matter what you're doing, I think it behooves us to be cognizant of the culture and understand what kind of culture you need to be successful. And basically, one of the things you do is whatever it is, whether it's a aluminum extruder, somebody I'm working for, or New Zealand or Air New Zealand, you benchmark world-class performance and safety or whatever for people who do that. Or a football team. We've got a culture barometer for a basketball team. We've got one for educational institutions, for high schools. Basically, you benchmark what it takes to be successful, whatever you deem to be success. And then you determine what the attributes are of people who are successful at that. And no matter what you're talking about, you can find people who are at the top of that category, whether it's Australian rules football or whether it's an aluminum extruder in Fonda, New York that I'm working for now. So you list the characteristics or attributes of that person who is very successful. And then you determine what the beliefs and values are that will automatically lead to the acquisition of those attributes. Our first attribute for safety is essentially do it for the right reason, which is because you care about people. One of the important attributes of organizations that have world-class safety is that everybody takes responsibility for safety. So you get the 10 or 15 attributes that produce success. You go after those attributes one at a time. You click them off, check them off. And once you've got all the attributes of what benchmarking has shown you, world-class whatever is, you are that, right? Right? Not necessarily. And the reason not is because usually, if you're anything like me, by the time you get to the third one, you forgot the first one. And you've lost that one. And Ben Franklin did that. He tried to improve his character, and he realized that when he was getting to the third character trait that he was slipping backward on the first one. And actually, the one that he talked about quite a bit, everybody knows who Ben Franklin is, don't you? Okay. He's America's Renaissance man. He's our Leonardo da Vinci. He discovered electricity, Franklin stove. Those of you who have bifocals, he discovered that. And he had a second-grade education. He was not a physicist or a scientist or whatever. That's my, when people say to me, well, you know, you're a chemical engineer and you're a certified safety professional, what do you know about sociology? So, well, George Washington never went to military school. Thomas Jefferson didn't have a degree in political science. Ben Franklin wasn't a physicist. They did fairly well in those fields. So at my age, I don't care whether anybody thinks I'm credible or not. I'm having fun, and the people who I work for seem to think they're learning something, and what I say seems to make sense to a lot of people. Let's go back to how you go about doing this. And basically, the way you improve culture is, what do you do to improve culture? What?
Assess what you've already got.
Exactly. You have to figure out where you are, and then you've got to figure out where you want to get to, and then you've got to have a program from getting to where you are to where you want to get to. It's exactly right. And in order to do that, you have to do what we call exercises. If you have a physical problem, if you've had surgery and muscle group is atrophied or whatever, what do? You go have physical therapy. If you're going to get a new job and you have to have new knowledge in order to do that job, what do? You go to school, you get a book, you read a book, you find somebody who's good at that, and you work under them or whatever. Basically, you do exercises. Our thesis is that's the same thing you have to do with regard to culture. To improve culture, you have to do exercises. And the only question is whether you're going to do those consciously or unconsciously. And if you can't measure, if you can't tell where you are now, if you can't tell where you're going to get to, you will do those exercises unconsciously. And if you're like Louis Gerstner and you're really good at what you do, you'll be right more than you're wrong, and you'll make a lot of progress. My thesis is, why guess? If you can write it down and you can quantify it and you can measure it, why not do that? Why not be rigorous enough to clearly define and profile your culture? Determine what you want it to be. There's something about a mission statement up here before. That's the beginning. The mission statement, doing a mission statement is kind of like preschool as opposed to creating culture profiles, which is like graduate school, at a graduate school. It is the beginning, though. You need to decide who you want to be. But then you've got to go through a fairly lengthy process of clearly defining that, educating people, winning over champions. How do you change culture? Is this really complicated?
Yeah.
How long does it take?
Years.
How many years?
I don't know.
Okay. If it's any comfort to you, I don't either. Conventional wisdom often is that it takes 10 or 20 years. Would you believe that I could give you an example of a case where the entire world's culture was changed in a nanosecond? Exactly. That was the first time I was to come to New Zealand, that night. So I know exactly the first time I came to New Zealand. It was 3 days later, because that plane didn't fly that night. I know exactly where I was standing. I was standing in the room in Clovis, California, my daughter Jill, and I saw the second plane hit the second building. I turned to my wife, and what do you think I said to her? Exactly. I looked at her, I said, honey, the world will never be the same again. Will the world ever be the same again? Where did the culture change? I mean, basically, American culture was, we have oceans on two sides, we're big, and we have reasonably friendly people to the north and south, and nobody can get us. That was basically our culture. Did that change when the second plane hit the building? You bet it changed. So, it's possible to change the culture of an entire world in a nanosecond. I don't recommend using that technique. Also, for those of you who have been involved in serious mishaps, if you have a fatality or a factory burned down or whatever, does that change the culture? You bet it does. You bet it does. Sometimes it results in people being fired, new people bring in, whatever. But we don't have to do that. There's a simple four-step process to change culture. And this is the way you do it, and it works every time. The first step is you state the precept, that you do safety because you care about your employees. And the lowest level of maturity there is the reason you do safety is for compliance, keeping costs down, and to keep stockholders happy or whatever. And the highest level of maturity is that you do safety because you passionately care about the well-being of your employees, and it's totally integrated with everything else you do. That's the highest level of maturity. So you state that, and then you explain why. The second step is you explain why the precept is being stated by the organization. And the third step is what? Practice. Exactly, exactly. The leadership sets the example. The leadership and the champions have to set the example. And you must have leadership support and you must have champions. Without the leadership, you can't do it. What's the fourth thing you have to do to change culture? Yeah, you got to keep doing the first three over and over again. It's a process, it's not an event. And one of our mantras is the process is the product. The process of talking about culture when you've got a methodology is the product. The product is not the nice bar graphs, the culture profile, or the culture index, or the list of attributes, or the beliefs and values, or the culture barometer, or whatever else. The process is the product. As you go through the process, you'll change the culture. And maybe you're going to lose a little sleep tonight because of this. And if you do, tough luck, because I've lost a lot of sleep over this. I reflected back when I had this epiphany about the importance of culture and saw somewhere between 10 and 50 times where I should have seen it. One of these was a project I had with 15 colleges and universities. They had a group captive insurance company, which meant they were all throwing money into the pot, and then the money came out of the pot to pay for the losses. 5 of them were really good and had very good loss experience. 5 of them were average, 5 of them were bad. How do you think the 5 good ones felt about the 5 bad ones? Yeah, bad, because they're basically paying their losses. And they said to me, go in there and find out what the heck's going on. So I went to the best of the best and the worst of the worst to start out with, to see the contrast. The best of the best, when I went in, I asked if they had a safety manager, and they said, no, we don't have one of those. And I said, do you have safety manuals? And they said, no, we don't have any of those. And I went to talk to the managers of the cafeteria, the athletic teams, and what have you, and I asked them, what are the hazards, what are the exposures, what are the problems in the area that you work in that somewhere between scare you and terrify you? And they could mentally list them, then you have to write them down. And I said, what are you doing about that? And they could each tell me, go write down exactly what they're doing about it. When I went to the worst of the worst, I asked if they had a safety manager. And they said, we've got 10 or 12 people who do that kind of stuff. We've got a fire protection engineer, we've got an industrial hygienist, we've got an ergonomist, we've got a safety inspector. Who do you want to talk to? So I talked to 1 or 2 of them. I said, do you have any manuals? And they said, oh, yeah. They had a whole shelf full of manuals. Then I went to the department managers, and I said, what are some of the problems? What are some of the hazards? What are some of the exposures you have in your area? What do you think they said to me? Exactly. They said the safety department takes care of that. What's the message here? You got to drive it down into the organization. Everybody has to take responsibility for safety. If you look at organizations that have world-class safety, they have certain characteristics. And the most prominent characteristic that they have is if you go to the organization and you ask anybody who's responsible for safety here, what do they tell you? They either say, I am, or we all are. They never say, my boss is, or the safety department is, or whatever. They never say that. If you have world-class safety, everyone takes responsibility for safety. So what's the message here? As Louis Gerstner said, it's all about the culture.